What if your worst nightmares were trying to tell you something you've forgotten? If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tell us about your stories and where you're watching from. Evelyn had never been to an orphanage, not once in her life. Yet every night she found herself trapped in a recurring dream, one filled with children's laughter that echoed in the shadows. The place was cold, silent, and endless, its walls alive with whispers. Each dream took her deeper into the building, a place she couldn't escape no matter how hard she tried. It was always the same. The flickering light, the distant sound of footsteps, and the smell of mildew and decay. Sometimes she'd hear a child's voice calling her name, soft and distant. Other times, the laughter of children would swirl around her, mocking, cruel, until she found herself running down a long, empty hall, her pulse racing. Every time she reached the end of the hallway, a door stood in her path, a door she couldn't open. She'd wake up just as her hand touched the cold, rusted knob. But that night was different. As she lay in bed, the echoes of the orphanage seemed to linger, in her mind, tugging at her like an invisible thread. She awoke with a strange sense of dread, her heart racing in her chest. A fleeting memory of a child's face, pale, with hollow eyes, lingered in her mind. She had never seen this face before, yet it felt oddly familiar. The whispers were louder that night, more insistent. A voice echoed in her mind, a soft, childlike whisper. "You're one of us." But Evelyn was no orphan. Her memories, fragmented as they were, told her otherwise. Was this just a nightmare? Or was it something else? As the days passed, Evelyn's life began to unravel. She felt an insatiable pull to uncover the truth, and the name of a place kept surfacing in her mind. The Orphanage of Lost Memories. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no mere dream. That the memories she was being haunted by belonged to someone else. Someone who had lived in that orphanage long before her time. But why had she never heard of it? Why was there no record of such a place? Her obsession with the name grew until it consumed her thoughts entirely. Evelyn's search led her to a decaying building. The sign above the door read, "The Orphanage of Lost Memories." Inside, the silence seemed to breathe, suffocating her. What if the truth you've been searching for was locked in a memory you were never meant to remember? Evelyn stepped into the dark hallways, her heart pounding against her ribs. The air was thick with dust and the silence was overwhelming. She could hear faint echoes, distant voices, as if the building itself was alive. A single door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. Her breath hitched as she approached. Her fingers grazed the cold, rotting wood of the door, and for a moment she hesitated. She felt the weight of the orphanage pressing down on her shoulders, a feeling of dread that twisted in her gut. She should turn back, leave, while she still could. But something deep inside her urged her to push forward. Inside, the room was nothing more than a dusty, abandoned nursery. The faded walls were adorned with peeling murals of happy children. But there was something wrong about them. Their eyes, painted with innocence, now seemed to follow her every move. The once cheerful faces had morphed into twisted, distorted versions of joy, mocking her, as though they knew she wasn't meant to be here. A cold gust of wind swept through the room as Evelyn turned toward the corner. There, standing motionless, was a child, a small girl with long, disheveled hair, staring at Evelyn with wide, unblinking eyes. Her clothes were torn, stained with dirt. "You remember me?" the girl whispered. Evelyn took a step back. The words, chilling in their simplicity, unsettled her. How could this child know her? She had never seen her face before in her life. "Who are you?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she simply pointed to a small, tattered box lying on the floor. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. This child, this place, it was all too much. She knelt down and opened it. Inside was an old photograph of a group of children. One of them was her as a little girl, smiling brightly. But something was wrong. Evelyn's face was blurred, her eyes darkened, almost as if they had been erased. The girl's voice echoed in Evelyn's mind, colder than ever. You can't leave, not yet." The girl vanished before Evelyn could speak another word. Her heart raced as she realized the room was no longer empty. The others were there, standing, in the shadows, watching her. When a mirror shows you something you've never seen, it's not just reflecting your face. It's showing you your past, your lost soul. As the days passed, Evelyn's dreams grew more intense. She began to see the faces of the children from the orphanage, their hollow eyes staring at her in her sleep. But there was one image that haunted her most: a mirror. A large, antique mirror standing alone in a dark room. In her dream, Evelyn stood before it, her reflection slowly distorting until it no longer resembled her. Instead, the face staring back at her was that of a child, her child self, with an expression of deep sadness. Evelyn reached out to touch the glass, but it felt colder than ice. She woke up gasping for air, her skin cold with sweat. The mirror in her dream was real. She had seen it before, back in the orphanage. It had to be. The same reflection had stared back at her in the photographs, in the faces of the other children. But what did it mean? Evelyn returned to the abandoned building once more, determined to uncover the truth. The air felt heavier now, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. She found the room with the mirror. The reflection was the same, her child self lost and forgotten, but this time something was different. Her reflection moved. It smiled. Evelyn stumbled back, heart pounding. The reflection didn't smile like her. It smiled in a way that felt wrong. A cruel smile, like it knew something she didn't. "Come closer," it beckoned, its voice a whisper, and Evelyn did. Evelyn reached out to touch the mirror. As her fingers made contact, the glass began to crack, and the reflection of the child reached out to her. What if the children you abandoned are still waiting for you? What if they were never meant to let you go? The mirror shattered in front of her. The shards seemed to fall in slow motion, cutting the air with sharp, painful clarity. The room around her twisted, the walls narrowing in on her, the darkness growing thicker by the second. The children's laughter returned, but this time it wasn't playful. It was mocking, cruel. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw them, the other children. They were no longer just shadows. They were real. They stood in a circle, eyes glowing with an eerie light. One child stepped forward, her face pale and empty. "You promised," she said, her voice hollow. Evelyn felt a sharp pain in her chest as a memory surged to the surface. She remembered running, escaping this place, leaving them behind. She had made a deal to forget. A deal to leave the orphanage forever, but the children weren't going to let her forget. Not now. "You left us," the child said, "and now you'll stay." Evelyn's legs gave way as she collapsed to the floor. The room swirled around her, the shadows closing in. The laughter of the children intensified, a cruel symphony in her ears. She was trapped, surrounded by the very faces she had once tried to forget. The shadows began to move closer, and Evelyn realized with growing horror that the circle wasn't just a trap, it was a choice. What if the price of freedom was a life? Your freedom, or theirs? The shadows grew thicker, pressing in on Evelyn's mind. She was trapped in the room with the children, their eyes fixed on her as they whispered in unison. "You belong to us." The room began to distort again, the walls bending and warping as if reality itself was being rewritten. Evelyn felt a pull deep inside her chest, something that connected her to the orphanage, to the children, to her forgotten past. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of this game. The room changed again. This time, Evelyn was outside. It was raining, cold, and she saw herself as a child running, trying to escape. Behind her, the orphanage loomed, its doors wide open, calling her back. And then, the figure appeared, a tall, shadowy presence. Its form was not human. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light as it stepped toward her. its voice echoing inside her mind. One must stay for another to leave. Evelyn looked at the child she had left behind, standing in the shadows. It was her. But it wasn't. She realized with growing terror that the choice wasn't just about leaving, it was about replacing. Would you trade your soul to escape a past you never knew existed? Evelyn stood in front of the tall figure, her body trembling with fear. She had made her choice once before, years ago, and now the price for her freedom had come. The shadows closed in tighter, and Evelyn's heart raced as the voice of the figure echoed in her mind. The exchange must be made. She turned toward the child standing in the doorway. It was her, but not. Her eyes were empty, hollow, a reflection of the past that had been taken from Evelyn. The deal had been made, and now it was time to fulfill it. Evelyn took a deep breath. She was going back. The room grew silent. The door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped through. But when she turned to look behind her, the orphanage was gone, along with everything she had ever known. Evelyn took one last look at the dark figure before her, feeling the weight of every erased memory, every broken promise. The past she had tried so desperately to bury now engulfed her, suffocating her with the revelation of her true identity. She had made a choice long ago, and now the price was about to be paid. The orphanage was not just a place. It was an invisible prison made of memories, promises, and secrets that could never be forgotten. And now, as she crossed the threshold of her own freedom, Evelyn realized that even if the building disappeared, the legacy of that story, that shadow, would remain inside her forever. She turned away from the orphanage, but the whispers never left her. They followed her, in her mind, in her dreams, in the dark corners of her soul. Because deep down, Evelyn knew that she would never truly leave. She smiled one last time at the child she once was, a child who, for some reason, was still trapped. And in that very moment, just before the shadows consumed the last remnants of her consciousness, she understood. She had never left the orphanage. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share this story with friends who also love a good psychological horror mystery. Don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales like this one. Until next time, if you dare to discover what else lurks in the shadows. The mirrors never lie, but they have a way of showing us what we cannot bear to see. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to bring more and more terrifying stories. Graham stood before the mirror in the dimly lit room, his heart racing. His breath came in shallow gasps as his eyes traced the cracked surface of the glass. The mirror wasn't anything special, just an old, tarnished object he found at an antique shop weeks ago. Yet tonight it seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it had a life of its own. He had been grieving the death of his wife Eleanor for months. The emptiness in their home was overwhelming, and he found himself staring into the mirror more often than he cared to admit. Tonight, however, something was different. As his gaze met the reflection, his pulse quickened. It was her. Eleanor's face stared back at him. But how? She had been gone for weeks, the reflection of her, dressed in the same white gown she wore, on the day of her death, was so real that he could almost reach out and touch her. Suddenly, a whisper came from the mirror. "Help me." Graham stumbled back, heart pounding. The mirror's surface rippled like water, as if the glass itself had become a doorway. The face of his deceased wife remained, her eyes pleading, her lips trembling in silent anguish. Before he could move, the reflection of Eleanor's face distorted. Her eyes turned black and her mouth curled into a wicked smile. In the silence of the grave, the dead speak their final truths. The night was long, the weight of the moment hanging over Graham like a shroud. He couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's twisted reflection, and her whisper echoed in his mind. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But as he lay awake, his mind raced back to the night of her death. He had found her at the bottom of the stairs, her body crumpled and lifeless. A tragic accident. Everyone had believed it was an accident. But what if it wasn't? As he stared into the mirror the next evening, trying to rationalize what he had seen, the glass once again rippled. This time, Eleanor's reflection was clearer, her face more sorrowful. She gazed at him, her expression one of quiet grief. Suddenly her lips parted. "You did this." The word sent a chill through Graham. His stomach twisted as the air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He stepped closer, unable to look away. Eleanor's reflection didn't move with him. She remained frozen in place, her eyes never leaving his. He blinked, and suddenly in the reflection, Eleanor's figure was standing just inches away from him, her eyes locked onto his, her face filled with rage. The truth has a way of creeping into the cracks of our minds when we least expect it. Graham could no longer deny the truth that had been whispering to him for weeks, even though he had refused to listen. He had to know. Had he truly caused her death? He began searching, digging through old photos and articles, desperate for some clue, something that would prove to him it wasn't his fault. He had to find something that would clear his name, that would help him forget the horrors that had been haunting him. But nothing came. There were no answers. Only questions. Then one night, as he returned home from another failed attempt at finding closure, Graham discovered something strange. The antique shop where he had bought the mirror didn't exist anymore. It had vanished, as if the building had never been there. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His mind reeled. What was happening? The mirror began to call him again. He couldn't stay away. As Graham stared at the glass, his reflection suddenly began to move independently of him. His reflection smiled as he stood frozen, trapped in the glass. There are no true reflections, only distortions of what we wish to believe. That night, Graham could not resist the pull of the mirror. Something inside him had snapped, and he found himself drawn to it like a moth to a flame. His hands trembled as he reached for the frame, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. Suddenly, the mirror rippled violently. He tried to step back, but the glass seemed to consume him, pulling him closer. His reflection flickered, then vanished. In its place, Eleanor's face appeared again, twisted and contorted, as if she were trying to break free from the glass. Before he could react, the glass shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. Graham fell to the floor, his eyes wide in terror. And then, he heard her voice again, louder this time, filling the room with an unbearable intensity. "You killed me." He scrambled to his feet, only to see Eleanor standing in the doorway. Alive, but not quite. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and decaying. Graham tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Eleanor reached out for him, her hand cold and lifeless, her touch dragging him toward the mirror. When you step into the darkness, it's not just the world that changes. You change too. Graham stumbled backward, but it was too late. Eleanor's hand gripped his wrist like iron, pulling him toward the mirror. With a final scream, he was dragged into the glass. The world around him shifted. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls were covered in shadows that seemed to move. He was no longer in his home. He had entered a world twisted by grief and guilt, a world where the line between the living and the dead was blurred beyond recognition. This was the other side of the mirror. In the dim light, he could see Eleanor standing before him. Her form was more monstrous now, a grotesque reflection of what she had once been. "Now you are mine," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. He tried to scream, but his throat felt tight, his body paralyzed with fear. As he reached out for the mirror, desperately trying to escape, a cold hand grabbed his shoulder. He turned to face her again, but this time, Eleanor was gone. All that remained was a figure standing in the shadows, a figure that was not him. The mirror doesn't just show us what we are. It shows us what we fear we might become. The world around Graham dissolved as the shadows closed in. Eleanor's voice echoed in the void, whispering his name. He had no choice but to face her now. "You are trapped here just as I am." The reflection of his own face in the shattered mirror grinned back at him. But it was not his own grin. It was Eleanor's. As the glass cracked further, the reflection seemed to bleed. Graham's soul was slipping away piece by piece as his body became nothing more than a shadow. And then in a final moment of clarity, he understood. The mirror didn't just reflect him. It had consumed him. And now, he was part of it forever. The last thing Graham saw was the reflection of himself smiling back at him. But his smile was twisted and cruel. And then, the world went black. What would you do if you found yourself face to face with the darkest corners of your own soul? Graham's torment isn't just about a haunting reflection. It's about confronting the guilt and truths we try to bury. The mirror doesn't simply show what is, it reveals what we've been running from. Now, as he's trapped in a twisted world of his own making, will he ever escape his past? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this chilling tale. Do you believe the mirror was merely a reflection, or was it something far darker? Don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a good mystery, and be sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales. You never know what's lurking just around the corner. Hit the bell icon to stay up to date on all things horror. The darkness is always watching. Isabella awoke to the oppressive silence that filled the small, dimly lit room. The walls, once adorned with memories of a life now lost, were peeling, as if the house itself wished to forget her presence. She had not yet become accustomed to her new reality, though it had been months since the accident. The accident. It felt like a shadow, lingering in every corner of her mind, yet she could never remember its precise details. She had survived. That was the thing that everyone said, and the thing that everyone believed was a miracle. But it did little to ease the aching emptiness that now consumed her. There were those who spoke of her recovery in hushed tones as if she were some rare specimen, half human, half ghost. Her face bore the marks of her survival, her skin forever scarred by the brutal reality of her crash. But the scars were more than just physical. They had become a part of her soul, an ever-present reminder of the night that should have taken her life. It was during the night, as she lay in her bed, that it began. At first, she thought it was a trick of her imagination. Perhaps it was the echo of her thoughts, the restless murmurs of a mind too tired to sleep. But then it happened again, sharper this time, clearer, like the whispering of 1,000 voices coming from within her own flesh. She reached up to touch her face, her fingertips grazing the jagged lines that marred her once beautiful skin, and then she heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. Her eyes darted open, heart thundering in her chest. The voice wasn't a voice and seemed to come from deep within the scars themselves. It was faint but unmistakable. It spoke, not in words, but in something far more disturbing, an emotion. A truth buried beneath the surface of her skin waiting to be unlocked. "Do you remember?" it asked. Isabella sat up in bed, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. She glanced around the room, but there was no one there. No one but the darkness pressing in around her. The voice seemed to echo through the hollow silence, its weight growing heavier with each passing second. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. She was trapped in her own skin, trapped by the past that refused to release her. Her fingers trembled as she pressed them to her face, to the place where the scar tissue was thickest. It was as if the skin itself had a life of its own, a will that defied her own. She could feel the faint pulse of something beneath it, something alive. And then, as if in response to her touch, the voice came again, louder this time. "It wasn't an accident." Isabella froze. The words cut through her like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. Her eyes widened as the world around her began to tilt. The room seemed to bend and warp, the walls shifting as though they were alive, pulsating, with some unseen rhythm. She gasped for air, her chest tightening as the whispers grew more frantic. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't an accident? What did that mean? She had no memory of the crash, no memory of how she had survived. She only knew the fragments, the broken glass, the twisted metal, the blood. And now, these whispers. Was she losing her mind? Who are you? She whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then, just as she thought the madness had passed, the voice spoke again, colder, more insistent this time. Listen closely. The truth is etched into your skin. You were saved for a reason. But the question is, who saved you? A shiver ran down her spine. The air felt colder now, as if the very room itself had turned against her. Isabella reached for the edge of her bed, steadying herself as her breath grew shallow. She could not tell if the voice was real or if it was simply the product of her fractured mind. But deep down, she knew it was something more. She had survived. Yes, but why? Before she could gather her thoughts, before she could force herself to understand the meaning behind those chilling words, the whispers came once more. Do you want to know the truth, Isabella? And as the final words rang in her ears, the room plunged into an unnatural silence, as though the very fabric of reality had paused, holding its breath. It was in this silence, this fragile moment before sleep, that she understood. There was no going back. The last whisper hung in the air, its lingering echo the only thing she could hear. Then, without warning, she felt a strange pressure against her skin, right where the scars ran deepest, and in the stillness of the night, a cold, unfamiliar voice whispered, "It's too late to turn back now." The days that followed were a blur of half-remembered faces and whispered conversations. The voices of the past seemed to grow louder in Isabella's mind, clawing at her thoughts, forcing her to relive the moments before the crash. She tried to focus, to return to the mundane rhythm of her life, but every quiet moment seemed to draw her back into that terrible night. Her body felt like a prison. The scars were not just marks of survival, they were something more, something that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The voice that had spoken to her in the dark now followed her through the day, echoing in the corners of her mind, always just out of reach. She had tried to speak to Eduardo, her closest friend, about what had been happening. He had been by her side since the accident, a constant presence in her life. But when she described the whispers, the sensation of being trapped within her own body, he had shaken his head, dismissing it as a side effect of trauma. "You're just tired, Isabella," he had said, his voice filled with concern. "You need rest. You've been through a lot." But it was not exhaustion that troubled her. It was something far deeper, something rooted in her skin. The voice was real. It was real. And it wasn't going away. That evening, as she lay in bed, the whispers began again. They were soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a windless night. But this time the voice was not the same. It was more urgent, more insistent. "Do you remember?" it asked again. But now there was a sharper edge to its tone, as if the voice were becoming impatient with her. Isabella's pulse quickened. She sat up, her body trembling. It felt as though the very air had thickened, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She reached for the scar on her arm, tracing the jagged lines with trembling fingers. Her mind raced, trying to recall anything from that night, the night of the crash. There were gaps, pieces of the memory that didn't fit, that didn't make sense. But the scars, the whispers, they seemed to know. They seemed to remember what she could not. As she lay there staring into the dark, she remembered something. A flash, a brief glimpse of a face, a shadow standing over her as she lay trapped in the wreckage. The memory was faint, like a half-forgotten dream. But it was there, just barely. Who had saved her? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the voice spoke once more. "You were not meant to survive. It was not an accident." The words twisted in her chest like a vice, constricting around her heart. She could feel the weight of them pressing into her skin, seeping into the scars, into the very marrow of her bones. She closed her eyes, trying to shut it all out, but the voice would not relent. "You have been chosen," it said, its tone no longer soft, but filled with an eerie certainty. You are part of something greater, something darker. Isabella's mind reeled. Chosen? What did that mean? How could this be part of something greater? And then, as if on cue, the pressure around her intensified. Her scars burned, a sharp, searing pain coursing through her body. She gasped, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the voice continued to speak, each word digging deeper into her soul. "The truth is etched into your flesh," the voice murmured, almost lovingly, "and now you must listen. You must understand what you have become." Her fingers dug into the sheets trying to steady herself, but no matter how tightly she gripped them, the pain, the burning, would not stop. It was as if her body were unraveling, each scar revealing something more, something darker. With a final anguished cry, she jerked herself up from the bed, the room spinning around her. She staggered to the mirror, her hands trembling as she reached for her reflection. There in the mirror she saw it, the scars. They were moving. Her heart skipped a beat. She could see them shifting, undulating beneath her skin, as though something was trying to break free. She recoiled in horror, stepping back, her breath coming in short gasps. The reflection of her own face was foreign to her now, as if someone else were staring back at her. The voice whispered once more, its words sinking deep into her mind. "Do you want to know the truth, Isabella? All you have to do is ask." She reached out, trembling, to touch the scar on her forehead, the one that had never hurt before. But the moment her fingers made contact, the reflection in the mirror shifted. Her own face twisted, contorting into something unrecognizable. The Albert whisper echoed through the room. "Ask and you will never be the same again." The days blurred together. The world outside seemed distant, disconnected from the torment that now lived within Isabella. Each passing hour brought with it a deepening unease. The whispers had not stopped, nor had they quieted. They grew louder, more frequent, until they followed her even in the light of day, curling around her thoughts like an insidious fog. She had tried to ignore them, tried to convince herself that the trauma of the accident had frayed her mind, that it was nothing more than the echoes of a broken soul desperately trying to make sense of an event too horrific to remember. But deep down, she knew better. The scars, they were alive. Not just marks on her skin, but something far more sinister. They held secrets, secrets that only the night seemed to reveal. Isabella had not told anyone the full truth. She had spoken to Eduardo, yes, but only in fragments. He did not believe her. No one would. Who would? Who could? It was madness, pure and simple, and yet she knew the truth of it. She had felt the scars move. She had felt the pulse beneath her skin like a heartbeat that did not belong to her own body. But it wasn't just the physical sensations that terrified her. It was the feeling of something watching, something waiting, as if the very air around her was charged with an unseen presence. She would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of her vision, shadows flitting just beyond the edge of her perception, always just out of sight. One evening, after a long day of restless wandering, Isabella found herself standing in front of the mirror once more. She hadn't meant to. It had been a reflex, a need to check her face, to see if the scars had changed. She told herself it was nothing more than vanity, but she knew the truth. She had to see them again. She had to know. As her eyes met her reflection, the air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive force. Her skin felt tight as if it was about to split open. She stared at the jagged marks running down her face, down her neck, down her arms. And then, without warning, she saw it. A figure. A face. Not in the mirror, but within the scars themselves. It was a fleeting image. Something that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a shadow too quick to catch. She blinked, and it was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed her fingers to her face, to the scar on her forehead, the one that had been untouched before. The moment her skin made contact, the voice whispered once more, this time with a tone of warning. a warning that chilled her to the bone. "Do not ask," it breathed. "You do not want to know." Her hand trembled as it hovered over the scar, the coldness of it spreading through her fingers like an infection, but she couldn't stop herself. The need for answers, for truth, was overwhelming. She had to know. She had to understand what had happened that night. "Why?" she whispered into the silence of the room. "Why was I saved?" The question hung in the air, suspended in the thick silence, and for a moment there was nothing but the steady thrum of her own heartbeat. And then, the room seemed to breathe. The walls, once still, began to shift, as though the very house had come alive. The shadows twisted and curled, expanding and contracting, like a living thing. The temperature in the room dropped, the air thickening with an unnatural cold. Isabella's breath turned to mist, and the sound of her heartbeat grew louder, more pronounced, as if it were no longer her own. She gasped, stepping back from the mirror. Her reflection seemed to blur, the edges of it warping, like ripples in water. And then she saw it, the scar on her face. It moved. Not like before, with the faint sensation of pulsing beneath her skin. No, this time, the scar itself shifted, twisting and contorting, as though it were alive. The flesh beneath it seemed to ripple, to breathe, and then a face, her face was emerging from the scar, a twisted, grotesque version of herself, its eyes hollow, its skin stretched tight like parchment. Its lips moved in sync with her own, forming words that were not her own. "You shouldn't have asked." The voice was not the one she had heard before. It was deeper, more guttural. Its tone laced with something dark, something ancient. Isabella stumbled back, her hand instinctively reaching for her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure in the scar smiled, a cruel, mocking smile that twisted her insides. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The room was suffocating now, the air thick with a pressure that weighed down on her chest. And then the voice that had haunted her every waking moment, spoke again. This time, it was not a whisper, it was a command. "Look again, Isabella. See what you have become." Isabella's hands trembled as she looked back at the scar, her reflection now entirely distorted, her own face replaced by the grotesque image that was emerging from her flesh. The eyes of the twisted figure seemed to pierce her soul, seeing everything, her fear, her confusion, her terror. And then, as the last remnants of her reflection dissolved into the shadows, the voice said one final, chilling thing. "You were never meant to live this life. You are mine." With a final shudder, the reflection disappeared, leaving only darkness in its wake. The coldness lingered in the room, suffocating her as the voice whispered once more, this time louder, more insistent. "It's too late to turn back now." Isabella couldn't remember the last time she had slept, or if she had even truly slept at all. The days and nights had blurred into one long, unbroken nightmare. Every moment, every breath she took, seemed tainted by the relentless whispers. The terrible realization that something far worse than she could ever comprehend was unfolding beneath her skin. Her body had become a prison, and her scars, the marks of her survival, had transformed into something far darker, something that not only scarred her body but began to tear at her very sanity. The face she had seen emerging from her skin, the cruel smile that twisted into the reflection of her own, had not disappeared. It lingered in her mind, like an infection, eating away at her sense of reality. Eduardo, ever the concerned friend, had urged her to visit a doctor to seek help, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She couldn't explain to anyone what was happening. How could she? How could anyone understand that the very wounds that should have healed were now talking to her, whispering dreadful truths about her own fate? She had tried, once, to shut them out. She had attempted to ignore the voice, to drown it out with noise, with distractions. But no matter how loud the world became around her, the voice always found its way through, always whispered from the very core of her being. "You are not what you think you are. It was a simple phrase, but it sent shivers down her spine each time it reverberated through her thoughts. She had always thought of herself as a survivor, a woman who had fought through tragedy and emerged on the other side. But now, with the weight of the scars, with the pressure of the whispers constantly pressing against her mind, she wondered if she was truly living at all. The house had grown colder. The air itself seemed thick, as though the shadows were becoming more than just a reflection of the dark corners of the rooms. They moved, slithered, writhed in the periphery of her vision. She walked down the hallway, her steps echoing in the silent house. She passed the mirror, and it was as if an invisible force pulled her toward it. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't resist. Her hand moved of its own accord, reaching out for the cold surface. The moment, her fingers brushed against the glass. The room around her seemed to shift. The walls groaned. The floor beneath her feet trembled as if the house itself were alive. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, growing into a maddening cacophony. "Look at yourself, Isabella. Look at what you've become." She closed, her eyes shaking her head, trying to block it out. But when she opened them again, the reflection was not her own. It was the face from the scar. The grotesque version of herself. Its hollow eyes staring back at her, its lips curling into that mocking, cruel smile. "You have been chosen," it said. The voice was dark, almost jubilant. "You thought you were saved, but you were wrong." Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. Chosen? The question from the night before echoed in her mind. She had felt it before, an ominous presence, but this felt different. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay, as if the very room had become a tomb. "You were never meant to survive," the reflection continued. "You were always meant to be a part of this, to become one of us." One of us? The words sunk into her like cold steel. She recoiled from the mirror, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her forehead, trying to steady her racing thoughts. What was this? What was happening to her? And then, in the silence that followed, something clicked. A realization, sudden and horrifying, washed over her. The scars, the whispers, the reflection, they were not just memories of the accident. They were a manifestation of something older, something far darker. The truth that had been hidden from her all along was now coming to light. She wasn't just a survivor of an accident. She had been chosen for something far more sinister, something that had been planned long before the crash. Her mind reeled. Who had saved her, and why? The voice, no longer a whisper, but a presence, in the very air, answered her, its tone suffused with malice. "You were marked before you ever even knew it," it hissed. "You were never meant to be free. You were always destined to serve us." The reflection in the mirror began to move again, the twisted version of her face contorting, shifting in ways that no human face should be able to. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, horrified by the sight before her. And then, before her eyes, the reflection smiled again. This time, it wasn't just cruel. It was victorious. "You are one of us now, and there is no escape." Isabella stumbled, backward, her legs giving out beneath her as the room seemed to close in on her. The whispers, now deafening, filled every inch of space. She looked around, frantic, but the house had transformed. The walls had shifted, the shadows twisted into something more, something alive. And then, in the deepest corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, someone standing in the dark, watching her. The figure stepped forward, its face hidden in the shadows, and spoke one final word. "It's time." The house was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a labyrinth of shadows, a prison with walls that closed in on her, suffocating her. Every step she took echoed, as if the house itself were listening, waiting, hungry. The whispers that had plagued her every waking moment had become a constant drone in the back of her mind. Louder now, sharper, as though something, or someone, was right behind her, watching, waiting for her to falter. The figure in the corner, the one that had spoken those chilling words, "It's time," had not moved. It stood there, as still as death itself, its face hidden in the shadows. Isabella could feel its presence in every corner of the room, an oppressive weight on her chest. She tried to move, to run, but her legs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. Fear held her in place, paralyzed. The voice spoke again, not from the figure, but from everywhere, surrounding her, flooding her thoughts. "You have come so far, Isabella, too far to turn back now." Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but her voice betrayed her, trapped in her throat, unable to escape. The house, this forsaken place, had consumed her, and now it was asking for payment. "You've always been a part of this, Isabella. The accident, the scars, the whispers, they were never accidents. You were chosen long before you even knew it. You were meant to be here." The truth finally revealed itself, as sharp and cold as the air around her. She had never been saved. She had been chosen. The voice wasn't just a whisper now. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices rising together, each one echoing the same horrific truth. She was part of them. She wanted to run, to escape, but there was no escape from this. Not anymore. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to push away the overwhelming sense of dread. But when she opened them again, the room had changed. It had twisted, contorted, like the reflection she had seen earlier. The walls were no longer solid. They wavered like smoke, shifting with every breath she took. And then she saw it. A figure, no, many figures, moved from the shadows. They were not human, but not entirely monstrous either. Their faces were obscured, hidden behind masks of flesh, but their eyes, they were all eyes. Endless hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. She stepped back, heart racing as they surrounded her, their eyes following her every move. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words wouldn't come. "You were always meant to join us, Isabella," one of them said, its voice a distorted, hollow echo that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You think your scars were the result of a tragic accident? No. They were the mark of your fate, the mark of our choosing." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The truth, that terrible truth, was finally here. The scars weren't just physical wounds. They were the symbols of her damnation. The price of her survival. She wanted to fight it, to deny it, but the voices grew louder, the figures closing in. The house, this place, had been waiting for her to unravel the truth. "You belong to us now," the voice continued. "Your soul, your body, they are ours." Isabella turned to the mirror once more. Her reflection twisted into something unrecognizable. The face in the glass smiled back at her, that same cruel, mocking smile. It wasn't her face anymore. It was them. And then, with a final sickening realization, she understood. The accident had never been the end of her life. It had been the beginning of her descent. She was never meant to escape. She had been pulled from the wreckage for a reason, to become one of them. "It's too late, Isabella," the voice whispered, as the figures moved in closer, their hollow eyes staring, waiting. "You are ours, forever." The walls around her closed in, the shadows swallowing her whole, and the last thing she heard was the soft whisper of her own name, twisted and distorted by the voices that surrounded her. "Isabella," and then silence. Her eyes snapped open. The room was empty. The shadows were gone. The figures, the whispers, everything had disappeared. But Isabella wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, her reflection stood, no longer in the mirror, but in the darkness. The twisted, grotesque version of herself smiled back at her, its hollow eyes gleaming with a knowing darkness. And as the silence stretched on, a single thought rang through her mind, louder than any whisper. She was never meant to escape. She was always meant to become them. Isabella thought she had survived the worst, but the truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Her scars, once signs of survival, became a curse, revealing horrifying secrets about her past and the sinister fate that awaited her. As the house closed in and the twisted figures surrounded her, Isabella realized she was never meant to escape. The accident had been just the beginning, and now she was bound to a fate far worse than death. The truth was clear. She belonged to them. Forever. What do you think of Isabella's terrifying journey? Could you feel the chill creeping in as the darkness took over? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. The terror is just beginning, and there's more where that came from.